We're going to transition to the next segment as we are doing this mad dash through enormous topics that all deserve a conference of their own. But hopefully what you're experiencing now is a really helpful introduction to ways of thinking about where we're at. This next session is brought to you in support from the Alexandra, you'll have to slap me down for how I say this, but the Heinrich Boll Stiftung, and so we greatly appreciate their support at this conference and for this session in particular. We're going to talk about leadership now, and this follows on nicely from the last two sessions. We've gone from diversity to disruption, and now we get to the tricky part, which is how do we actually accomplish what we need to accomplish on behalf of our communities. And a big part of that is rethinking leadership in the media. And so we have with us Eliza Anyangwe, who is joining us from Amsterdam. And Eliza is now with the Correspondent, but has been in multiple newsrooms. You may know her columns from The Guardian. She has experience with CNN, international and elsewhere. So, and Alexandra is a thought leader who has worked at Reuters and is working with the Table Stakes program. And Alexandra, the Table Stakes is sponsored by whom? What is the organization you're a part of?
It's run by one IFRA, the World Association of News Publishers, and it's sponsored by the Google News Institute.
Okay. Eliza, let's launch with you. And maybe the first step is to sort of talk a bit about the leadership crisis as you see it across newsrooms. We're going to migrate to what are some signs and lessons that we can apply to our own cultures. But overall, I don't want you to sugarcoat it. Where are we at in terms of leadership in the news business and the newsrooms and the challenge that is in front of us?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and talking with you about this subject. For me, one of the things that I think is most crucial is to separate out the question of leadership from that of management, because leadership is about vision and direction, and management can just be about, sort of like playing on the Titanic while the ship is going down, right? That just needs good management to organize. I also can't, of course, speak for newsrooms, and I don't know where the speakers and the attendees are and what the reality is there where people are. And so it is not at all to rubbish the value of management, because sometimes giving your actual context, that might be what is necessary. But for me, what I have seen and learned over relatively short career in journalism, I used to work in international development beforehand, is that oftentimes newsrooms, particularly at the height of the economic crisis, have just assumed that leadership is about sort of like hitching our bandwagon to whatever is currently trendy. So, what is going to save journalism? Let it, it's going to be audio. No, it's going to be AI. And the person who is lauded as the leader is the person who sort of hitches their bandwagon and champions that horse most vocally. And yet, the more quiet, important work, which is asking fundamentally, what is journalism? And are we continuing to serve the purpose that journalism exists? And newsrooms have evolved in a specific way and have had a specific business model, but let us not confound the model with the purpose. And what is that purpose for journalism? And are we actually fulfilling it? And are we listening to the voices that are critiquing us, or are we just saying, well, go off and start your own citizen journalism platform or whatever? And that is what I think has been really often missing, is that actually, if you look at the people who are newsroom leaders today, they could just be direct descendants of people who were newsroom leaders 100 years ago. And not just in terms of the sort of gender or color of their skin, but also in their thoughts about what it is that journalism is supposed to do and the relationship between the journalist and the audience, etc. So that for me is one big disappointment, really, in that we're not asking what is essentially the more fundamental questions about what should journalism be doing, what role should it play, what is its role, particularly in democracies. We're just trying to compete for ad revenue with Google or Facebook, and not actually redefine what our organization should be. And then internally, the questions which I'm sure already have been raised in other panels about sort of diversity and inclusion. How do we go from sort of like tokenized figures in leadership, such as myself, one person who is supposed to encapsulate the full will and intention of the rest of the newsroom, to creating safe spaces within our news organizations. Let me stop there.
So Alexandra, if it's okay, where I'd like to start with you in picking up on that is something that you and I've had the privilege of hearing you speak to this before, but is about, we're particularly bad in the news media of developing leaders, right? I mean, there's this, you know, there are issues that are problems across, and this is where David, our last speaker, sort of cautioned us not to think of ourselves as exceptional. But I think there are some ways in which people get promoted based on their journalism, and then they're in leadership positions. And what makes them a great journalist is not connected to what makes somebody a good leader. So I suggest that as a starting point, but I also want you to respond to Eliza. But can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. I mean, that's actually true for many industries. What got you there doesn't necessarily help you there. And my experience is deeply rooted in journalism. I spent 25 years in newsrooms, 15 of these in leadership roles as a managing editor for Süddeutsche Zeitung. And now I'm helping newsrooms from all over Europe with digital transformation. And yeah, what really is the leadership role? Actually, it's really funny that other than suggested in commentaries that are about the workplace and new work and whatever, news organizations are deeply hierarchical organizations. Why is that? Because news situations are constantly evolving and changing, and you just, you deal with that by having very, very, strict processes, structures, whatever. So that makes it really, really hard to adjust to rapidly changing environments, business environments, which is really one thing. And then also the tradition of dividing the business side and the editorial side, church state, as you say in the English language, really has led to that thing that journalists don't know the first thing about management. And they're actually even taking pride in this, that they don't have an idea about business, because they never had to take care of this. So this is really a very big roadblock to change. And the key task that leaders have today, I think, is really helping their people to acquire a learning mindset that is not just one thing that's like this change management project that you start and you have a huge project plan and then you follow all the steps and then you're done. No, you're never really done, because rapidly changing environments really require us to constantly change, constantly be on the lookout to things, and then also make really clear judgments on what Eliza just said. Is this just a trend, or is this something that will help our businesses thrive? Is this something that will help to gain trust, and not only trust with your audiences, but also within your own staff, within your newsroom? So this is really something that leaders have to manage. So they have to really instill the confidence in the newsroom that it's really possible to adjust to rapidly changing business environments and also trust environments whatsoever, while still keeping focused on producing great journalism with constantly changing news situations. So that is quite tricky. Change is the new normal, and to equip your newsroom, your staff, actually not only the newsroom, but the whole business with these skills is really tricky.
So a note to our audience, once again, we take comments and questions in the Q&A box. And if you have specific issues that you're dealing with in your newsroom, we would love to hear them. Again, we have two terrific leaders here to speak to these issues. Eliza, what I'd love to pick up on from what Alexandra is saying is that, there are these words that I'm thinking about from the work that the way that your work overlaps with one another. And one of those words is hierarchies, right? And so what are your thoughts on the hierarchies aren't the problem,
Yeah.
meaning hierarchy itself, having a hierarchy. Alexandra, that was such a good way of helping remind us that because of the work that we're doing, we actually need frames, we need structures, we need something in order to serve the communities we want to serve. And yet, there is something about the hierarchical thinking in our field that means change is incredibly, incredibly difficult because of the sort of skeleton that we're all sort of built upon. So Eliza, your thoughts on thoughts and wisdom on this notion of hierarchy. How should we think about this now?
Yeah, I mean, it seems rich as someone whose job title is managing editor to turn around and go, oh no, we don't need any hierarchy. Like, I'm pretty close to the top of the of the garbage heap. But let me say this, that I find it that in some ways, as we try to keep pace with the way our world is going, and let's be very clear, with certain types of organizations in that world, right? So the Silicon Valley and tech organizations are very much setting the tone for how we all dress and present ourselves at work and job titles that we come up with. And we are not necessarily living in that same reality that they are. And actually, if we were to look at it a bit critically, maybe we don't want to be living in that reality, that's the sort of move fast and break things reality, right? I can't go through the world without always acknowledging the multiple identities that I carry with me into the workplace. And that is not necessarily safer at Google or Facebook than it is necessarily at The Guardian or The Correspondent. So I say that to mean that the sort of flat, sort of decentralized structure, while it is appealing, should always serve your mission in your organization and your people and the work that you want to do in the world. And hierarchy is not a bad word, because actually what people always need is a sense of what their boundaries are. And this isn't an organizational issue. This is a human issue. We're very bad, or we have been very often not taught how to hold our boundaries, how to set boundaries and hold them. And those same people who haven't learned that as individuals are also in leadership roles in organizations. And so what we do is sort of like ping pong, we oscillate from sort of really rigid power and hierarchical structures to claiming that there is no power and hierarchy, and yet that just moves implicitly rather than explicitly. So if we want to understand that power resides in different places, that there are people who can be leaders without also carrying the job title of managers, and want to facilitate those ideas to come up in our organizations, wherever they might bubble up, that requires a certain structure and a certain freedom to be able to allow it to happen. But we know that people still need a sort of nurturing environment in which they can grow. They also need an environment in which, if they're having any kind of organizational struggles, they are helped through that. And at the same time, because the mission of the organization and that of the individual overlaps only so far, but doesn't always go the full way, there needs to be a way that people go their separate routes. I've had a far healthier relationship with my employers when I realized that my well-being and my value in life, it is separate to theirs. When I understand that my job is to make sure that I am contented and fulfilled as a person, and if I can do that at work, that is great. But if I can't, that is also fine. And then I kind of reimagine my relationship with both those above me and those below me. So I really think that we need a sort of return to our own individual power, our own sense of where we reside within organizations, and then rethink how we talk about and structure the relationships and the hierarchies that will inevitably exist, whether we make them explicit or implicit.
Alexandra, off of that, are there things from the table stakes program that point us to best practices in the notion? I mean, I really like the framing from Eliza about understanding explicit and implicit power that exists in organizations, and then migrating that to, okay, how do we actually empower the people that we've brought in, rather than fitting them into a slot and saying, yep, now you're here, all set, and we don't listen to them. What are you seeing across news organizations that we should look to as the examples to follow?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with Eliza. You can always only understand freedom in the context of boundaries. If you don't have boundaries, you don't have freedom, you just have anarchy. So you need rules and boundaries, but at the same time, you need to empower people, or you need to empower teams to really have their freedom, their space, and their freedom to test and experiment things and learn from them, and then communicate these lessons to others, and in this way, ideally, generate really small success stories. And that's actually what the table stakes project, digital transformation project, is all about. This is we have in our cohort now 12 publishers. Last year we had 14. This year actually we have 24 in 2 cohorts, so we expanded it. This is really bringing on the learning mindset and enabling small teams to test and experiment stuff and then produce success stories, going to their leaders, tell them, look, this works, so you can, there's this common assumption that, only when top management is committed and has a vision and has a clear strategy, whatever, change can work. Our experience is actually that change can also work from the bottom up, at least, in certain circumstances, if you empower teams and enable small scale experimenting, because then that might change top leadership's minds. Top leadership is not like static. I mean, they are really uncertain in many issues. They're insecure. They really fear for their job security at times. And if there's a team that brings in something new and some input and tells them, look, this worked with us and this worked with our audiences, and let's try this in other departments, whatever, then they say, oh, this is good news. This could also help my career. So it's much more, power is distributed much more fluidly than this assumption is like, the CEO decides everything, or the editor-in-chief decides everything, and it all depends on the vision of some great guy. So small scale experimenting, is being agile, really is really important.
How do you do that without people being aware of what they need to give up in terms of control, right? So there's the need for order, that there needs to be that structure, but this sort of bottom up approach, and frankly, probably not even just bottom up, right? But lateral and mid-level managers are vital to this too. But can you do it without leadership recognizing they need to have a different relationship with the control that they hold?
Well, it really depends on what leadership does. I mean, if leadership is really micromanaging, it's really hard. And if leadership is dead set against something, that's different from leadership being maybe ambivalent or preoccupied with other things. So you can actually do stuff in teams if you have the power to try out things. Obviously, what's really important, and the digital world helps us with that, is you need to back up your experiments with data. And with data, I don't only mean like tools and analytics that you can buy, and there's always this complaint, oh, we just don't have enough data to prove it. Sometimes it can also be, just talk to people, talk to your audiences, engage with them. This is also data. This is common sense, is also data. But you need to, at some point, you need to back up your success stories with data, and then you need to show others, look, this works, and we can replicate this experiment. I mean, this is like in science, you experiment and then you try to replicate it, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. The good thing with experiments is you can also learn from, well, I wouldn't say failures, but lack of success, because then you find out what doesn't work, and then you can go the other way. There won't be any kind of recipe that will guide us through this world and deliver us the ultimate solution, the ultimate problem solving capacities. There will always be experimentation because the environment is changing.
Eliza,
Yeah.
I thought you picked that up. I mean, what are your thoughts from what Alexandra has just said, and maybe to add to that, right? Kind of a little bit of a little bit of what gives you hope. Like, what are some of the things? I know there are a lot of reasons to be, and this is your word, despondent, right, from recent history. But what are the ways that we are seeing some shifts in mindset and some people adopting the learning mindset? Um, I'll leave it there. Like, what are you seeing that
I mean,
we should build on?
I'm very spoiled, right? Because I work at the Correspondent and we are member funded and have sort of ejected ourselves from the game of, or, needing to find ad revenue and therefore needing data about our members or our readers, etc. For better or for worse, right? And a lot of other people in leadership are not working for the kinds of news organizations where they have that privilege to sort of, eject themselves from the status quo of how their organizations are run. And so I appreciate that trying to bring about, to experiment, as Alexandra was saying in that context, is very difficult. Let us not for one second ignore the enormous financial, economic, and actually also political challenges of being a journalist and of working in a newsroom today, right? Across the world, violence against journalists is going through the roof. Across the world, there's suppression of freedom of speech. And across the world, newsrooms are faltering in their ability to figure out how they sustain the thing that they want to do. So it is one thing to have this conversation in a vacuum and something entirely different for someone against that backdrop to go back into their newsroom and say, I'm here to experiment and to positively frame failure, as Alexandra has put it. I think failure needs a complete new sort of PR exercise, because you can't have an experiment if you're not comfortable with failing. And if you do them at a sort of small enough scale, if you're nimble enough, and if you provide your people with safety and security so that they know that there are no direct repercussions for failure, then we have a far more healthy attitude towards failing. And if you do it from the self-interest that Alexandra has pointed out, which is kind of like, it can be good for you if I take experiments down here, then we're hopefully heading towards a place where experimentation becomes the norm and can become possible, because I think we desperately need it, because we're fighting wars on so many different fronts in journalism, and we need to be trying lots of different things. I'm hopeful because I think that the fact that we continue to have these sorts of conversations against the backdrop that I have just outlined is a sign that there are still people in this industry who want it to be sort of heading towards its better self, right? We haven't sort of just battered down the hatches and are just waiting for the day where, Siri writes the stories. So there is a sort of continued desire to want us to be doing more and better what we're doing. And that's great. What I'm also really enthused by is by the number of risk takers, both people within news organizations who are calling out their organizations and holding them to account, and people who are stepping outside of that to try and set up their own platforms. Whether or not they will be sort of competing with legacy media is not really the point, because we just need a plurality of voices telling a plurality of stories, because we need to cast a better, wider lens at what the world actually is, right? So will we be sort of the next Ted Turners creating new CNNs? Hopefully not. What instead can happen is that there is, nature abhors monoculture, and that maybe there will be room to sort of nurture the kind of leaders who will be both useful within our news organizations, but able to step outside of them too.
Alexandra, I'd love to hear your response to that, but maybe just would add something from an early, the first session of the day. Jennifer Brendel made a comment that I think resonates here again, which is when you ask people to do something new, you have to actually have something I'm paraphrasing. You have to, they need to stop doing other things. Like I'm very conscious of and experiencing this with the teams I work with, right? This is a year where people are trying to do too much as journalists. Partly it's pride, but partly I think it is structural, right? Our organizations aren't taking care of people as well as we could. So part of this is there are new things that everybody needs to do. What are the things that we should be doing less of? Like, are you seeing things through the table stakes program where organizations are putting too much of a priority on something that no longer serves the audience? And there are just good practices of things that we should do less of so that there is more room to take risks and to, as you both have pointed out, really to allow people to fail with empathy and learning rather than fail with fear of losing their jobs.
I mean, every organization is different, so it tends to be different things they need to stop doing, and they need to really learn about their environment they're operating in, their communities. Table stakes is basically for local and regional news organizations, which have a really important role now with the COVID-19, because they really provide services and information that people can't get elsewhere. So that's actually the point. Start with where you can be indispensable and stop the stuff where you are, to use that word, that phrase, me too, just, me too stuff that you just write because you feel it's needed, but everyone gets it everywhere, or others in your region do it. So try to focus on the stuff that you can really do. Then what's also really important, focus on being indispensable by providing services. As a journalist in prestigious news organizations who has grown up in prestigious news organizations, I know that service journalism has a really bad reputation. Everyone wants to write that great feature story, or that, report, or do investigative coverage. And service journalism is like, what is this? But it's actually something many people are really craving for, because they need the facts on, lots of life decisions, particularly now, that they need to know what's happening in their communities, or, what to do with where to spend their money, or how to, whatever. Sometimes even, keeping people entertained during lockdown is also sort of a service. So you really need to look at your journalism more in that lens. Where am I really providing a service, and do more of a service than just understanding journalism as an art form and as just something where, you can throw big ideas at people. This is also, there's also an audience for, big ideas being thrown at them, but you should really look at the things where you can provide a unique experience, and do less of the rest. And then when you look at data also about, what audiences are really consuming or reading or listening to, whatever, the experiences are that like the typical mid-size articles that we use to write for newspapers, they are just not that important. Just, do really short stuff, or really invest resources in doing long stuff, investigations, really good reporting with different perspectives, and really talking to people, and not the stuff that's sort of in the middle, this, he said, she said journalism, as I tend to say, where you just sort of report what some politician said about something. So do much less of that. I know that, there are politicians that will be super annoyed, not only politicians, but also other people with functions, but do less of that and focus on audience's needs, really. And then what Eliza said, and I really want to come in on that, is also diversity is so important. Diversity of perspectives in newsrooms. I always say, really, diversity is not a nice to have. It is at the core of the digital transformation, because you need to focus on a diversity of audiences. Very often people who have metrics and dashboards, whatever, they look at their data and they tend to overserve those that they already have as readers or listeners or viewers, and they tend to underserve those that they don't have. But there's really a lot of potential. Every third person, this is what the digital news report of the Reuters Institute says, every third person is really avoiding news very, very often, because it's too negative, it's too much, maybe too biased, it's not relevant enough. So there's a lot of potential. And just by looking at the data of the people who already engage with your content, that's not enough. You really have to broaden your perspective.
Yeah, if I can just piggyback on that, I think what you just said, Alexandra, is perfect, all of it. I think that if you were to, unless you're a local newsroom, and we very, very rarely in spaces like this, or even at all, really acknowledge the dire straits that a lot of local media is in, right? So unless you're a local newsroom or even a hyper local, truthfully, what is the value in you covering news? Like, it doesn't tend to be applicable in my life or in someone, because I live up my days particularly during COVID and lockdown, in a very small radius. And the stories that I hear from across the world are really just editorial decisions made based on sort of geopolitics that has been true for the last 60 years, not really what's actually happening in the world or what I should know about or whether it means anything to me. It's just because we've decided, Iraq and Iran are more important than reading about than Chad and Central Africa or whatever, because of lots of interest that all the people here are very intelligent and understand. So, unless you're talking about sort of national news events and maybe what, at the Correspondent we call transnational news, all the rest should just be left to local media. And we should be distraught at the fact that local media can barely survive. And we should be distraught at the fact that local radio and, local magazines, etc., can barely survive, because we are all competing to tell the kinds of stories, mostly ignoring most of them, and that we shouldn't be telling, and that we don't have people embedded in those communities to report on. So the question of service journalism is really important. When you ask the question, Graham, I just wrote, write less news and write fewer stories. Like we just crack out so much stuff. And most of it isn't going to get the eyeballs that it requires. And actually, even more importantly than reads, most of it is not going to have the impact that it can have because our job should be about meaning making, not about filling people's timelines or pinging their phone with ceaseless notifications, right? So this brings us sort of full circle to where I started out, which is, if you don't have the leadership in the newsroom that says, hey guys, we haven't promised anybody that we need to publish 5 stories today, let alone 500 stories today. Who is it going to hurt if we do not do that? What do we do if we do not publish anything today? If we deem that there is no news worth publishing today, if we cannot do one of 2 things, add something to it or give it some meaning and context. If that is all being provided elsewhere, how do we build a relationship? And this is a sort of media literacy piece that has to start within our organizations and then with our audiences, where we actually try and say to people, hey, you might be avoiding the news now, but those same people, let's be honest, who are avoiding the news are critical of slow news organizations. Often they'll be like, well, I came here for news and there isn't any. And that's because of what, we have fed people a diet of sort of like ceaseless sound bites. And if we are to retrain them on a diet of deeper, more meaningful, slower, more thoughtfully constructed journalism, we are going to have a very high tolerance for it ourselves within our own organizations. We'll have to move the incentive structures to celebrate the types of people that do this kind of work in our organization, not celebrate the ones who are there first, who stole a lead from someone else, who kind of all that kind of work that really in 2020, how much of it do we actually need, right? Journalism needs to be far more collaborative today than competitive to be able to do the kind of meaning making that our audiences require. So we need to shift our incentive structures to be able to facilitate that kind of journalism. And then we need to ask our members and our readers and our viewers and our audiences to journey with us as we try and do that, because we're not going to get it right straight away. But given the sort of lack of appetite for what we're currently doing, all we can do is try.
This is a terrific, nearly closing point. I do want to give you one more moment too, Alexandra, to respond to that. But I just want to say what's resonating with me from both of you is the need of our leaders to have a little bit more courage, to sort of own what the organizations are trying to do, be thoughtful about what the audience really needs from you. And some of that means extending that courage through support to your teams. But I think also the reality of when you say incentives, right? How do you actually make sure that your staff is solving the right puzzle for your audience, which means giving up some of the old ways of status, right? The old, if you're the 8th article on something, we didn't need it. So I think this is actually really helpful as an instructional tool for leaders of how to empower and set people up for success, that you will, as Alexandra says, you'll benefit from it. You'll look good if you're more inclusive with your audience. Alexandra, anything else in our final 30 seconds that you'd like to share before
30
we...
seconds. Okay.
Well,
it is.
I'm not going to cut you off. I know the team is ready to get to the next segment, but
Okay.
let's close with a bit more.
Now, really, journalism should be about impact and not about impressing the editor-in-chief, the competition, or winning journalism awards. It should be about really helping audiences, and also, obviously, it should help the news business itself to survive, because if it doesn't survive, there won't be journalism any longer. So you really have to think about your business model. That is important, because only if you have a business model, you can generate impact. So that's the balance: business model plus impact. And that's where you should be relentlessly evaluating what you're doing according to these categories. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, Alexandra, Eliza, thank you both so much for your work out into the world, first and foremost, but being generous and sharing some of the lessons with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Have a good evening.